In 1970, millions of Americans rushed to theaters to see the boys in the band. They couldn't take their eyes off the cowboy. With his golden hair and perfect body, Robert La Tourneaux was packaged and sold to the audience as a sexy birthday present. But Hollywood didn't care about his actual talent. They only wanted his body. They treated him like a disposable object from the very beginning. And once the industry was finished using him, they threw him away to the streets, leaving him to die a lonely and brutal death from AIDS. Robert Earl La Tourneaux was born on November 22, 1941, in St. Louis, Missouri. From the moment he could walk, Robert was different. He possessed a physical beauty that was unsettling for a boy in the Midwest. Adults stared. Other children sensed a fragility in him that made him a target. In a culture that valued rough hands and stoic silence, Robert was sensitive, observant, and quiet. He learned to hide early. He realized that his face was a mask. If he smiled the right way, if he stood the right way, people projected their own desires onto him. They saw a good boy. They saw a future husband, a future father, a future pillar of the community. Robert saw a prison. By his teenage years, the disparity between his internal reality and his external performance was a canyon. He was gay in a time and place where the word barely existed outside of medical textbooks and police reports. Every interaction was a calculation. Every handshake, every laugh, every conversation about girls was a carefully rehearsed lie. He spent his youth in front of mirrors. He wasn't just checking his hair, he was studying his instrument. He learned that he could control a room simply by entering it. He learned that his looks were currency. In St. Louis, that currency could buy him safety, but it couldn't buy him freedom. He knew that if he stayed, the weight of the lie would crush him. He would become a miserable, closeted man, drinking away the secret in a dimly lit tavern. He chose escape. New York City in the early 1960s was a machine that turned nobodies into legends. Robert arrived with nothing but a suitcase and a face that could stop traffic. His first act of show business was the destruction of his own history. Robert Earl La Tourneaux was too flat, too Midwestern. It sounded like a mechanic or a grocer. He needed a name that matched the face he saw in the mirror. He became Robert La Tourneaux. The change was subtle but seismic. La Tourneaux suggested French aristocracy. It suggested mystery. It gave him permission to be someone else. With a new name, he could detach from the scared kid in St. Louis and become the predator in Manhattan. He found work almost immediately, but not as an actor. He worked as a model. Modeling in the 1960s was a brutal education. It taught Robert that he was an object. He spent hours under hot studio lights, being poked and prodded by photographers who treated him like a mannequin. They adjusted his chin. They pulled at his clothes. They talked about him as if he wasn't in the room. Turn to the left. No, less emotion, just look pretty. Be a statue. He learned to freeze. He learned to detach his mind from his body. This dissociation was a survival mechanism that would serve him well in Hollywood and later destroy him in the sex trade. He became a master of being looked at. He realized that people didn't want him. They wanted the fantasy of him. He modeled for catalogs, for print ads, for anything that paid the rent. He lived in cheap apartments, navigating the underground gay scene of New York. It was a shadowy, exciting world. For the first time, he wasn't the only one. He met other men who were living double lives. But even in this community, Robert was often isolated by his own ambition. He didn't want to just survive. He wanted to be a star. He started taking acting classes. He was hungry. He possessed a raw, nervous energy that teachers found compelling. He wasn't a classically trained Shakespearean actor. He was a natural. He used his own anxiety, his own fear of exposure, and channeled it into his characters. 1967 was the year the door kicked open. Robert was cast in the Broadway musical Ilya Darling. The show was a massive production, a musical adaptation of the hit film Never on Sunday, starring the Greek legend Melina Mercouri. Walking onto the stage of the Mark Hellinger Theater was a drug. The sheer scale of it, the orchestra, the lights, the roar of the audience, erased the silence of his childhood. When the spotlight hit him, he wasn't hiding anymore. He was being seen, and he was being applauded for it. He wasn't the lead, but he was impossible to miss. Critics mentioned him. The audience whispered about him. Who is that one? The handsome one in the back. He was building a reputation. He was professional. He was on time, and he was beautiful. Industry insiders began to circle. Agents, managers, and casting directors saw a gold mine. He had the look of a young Rock Hudson, but with a darker, more modern edge. Television came next. NBC cast him in The Doctors, a popular daytime soap opera. He played Mike Powers. The role of Mike Powers was the archetype of the all-American male. He was strong, romantic, and heterosexual. Robert played him with a brooding intensity that made him an instant heartthrob. Housewives across America fell in love with Mike Powers. They sent fan mail. They dreamed of him. This was the height of the irony. Robert was being paid to impersonate the very type of man he could never be. He was selling a lie to millions of people every day, but the success was intoxicating. He had money in his pocket. He was invited to parties. He was someone. The glass closet of 1960s New York was a strange place. Inside the industry, Robert's sexuality was an open secret. People knew. The costume designers knew. The directors knew. But as long as the public didn't know, it was allowed. It was a precarious existence. One slip-up, one arrest, one wrong look in public, and it would all be over. Robert navigated this minefield with a terrified grace. He brought girls to premieres. He laughed at the right jokes. He played the game. He thought he could keep the mask on forever. He thought he could separate Robert La Tourneaux, the actor, from Robert La Tourneaux, the man. He was wrong. In late 1967, a script began to circulate in the theater district. It was titled The Boys in the Band. Written by Mark Crowley, it was unlike anything that had ever been produced. It wasn't a coded drama. It wasn't a tragedy where the gay villain dies in the third act. It was a slice of life. It was a birthday party. It was a group of gay men in Manhattan drinking, fighting, and tearing each other apart with razor-sharp wit. The script called for a character named Cowboy. The character description was brutal. A young, beautiful, simple-minded hustler. A birthday gift for one of the main characters. He is sweet, dim, and purely physical. Robert's agent sent him the script. For most actors, playing a dumb hustler would be an insult. But Robert saw something else. He saw the truth. He knew the cowboy. He had seen boys like the cowboy in the bars of the West Village, beautiful, lost young men who relied on the kindness of older, richer men to survive. He understood the transactional nature of the character he auditioned. When he walked into the room, the casting team stopped talking. He was wearing tight jeans and a t-shirt. He didn't have to act. He simply was. He possessed that unique combination of physical perfection and vacancy that the role required. He looked like a dream, but his eyes held a profound emptiness. He got the part. The Boys in the Band opened off-Broadway in January 1968. It was expected to be a small niche production. Instead, it detonated. It became the hottest ticket in New York. The lines went around the block. Celebrities like Jackie Kennedy and Marlene Dietrich came to see it. It was a cultural phenomenon. For Robert, It was the pinnacle. He was on stage every night playing a character that audiences loved. They laughed at his lines. They swooned over his appearance. The reviews were glowing. The New York Times praised the cast. But there was a poison in the praise. The critics weren't calling him a great actor. They were calling him a great type. They assumed that because he played the part so well, he must be that person. They looked at Robert, and they didn't see a man performing a complex role. They saw a prostitute. He was trapped in his own success. The role of Cowboy was the himbo, the sexual object. By playing it perfectly, he was cementing his image not as a serious dramatic artist, but as a piece of meat. He was having the time of his life. The cast became a family. They drank together. They partied together. They rode the wave of fame together. For a brief moment, Robert felt safe. He was surrounded by other gay men working on a project that was honest about who they were. He didn't know that this safety was an illusion. He didn't know that by stepping into the light, he was making himself a target. In 1969, the decision was made to turn the play into a major motion picture. William Friedkin, a director known for his intensity and grit, was hired to helm the project. In a move that shocked the industry, Friedkin refused to cast big-name stars. He insisted on using the original off-Broadway cast. Robert La Tourneaux was going to Hollywood. This was the dream. This was what he had left St. Louis for. He was going to be in a movie. His face was going to be 30 feet tall on screens across the world. But Hollywood in 1970 was a dangerous place for a man like Robert. The studio system was collapsing, but the homophobia was stronger than ever. The executives at Cinema Center Films were terrified of the project. They thought it was career suicide. When the cast arrived in Los Angeles, they were treated like a sideshow. They were the fag cast. Robert felt the shift immediately. On stage in New York, the cowboy was a character in a play. In front of a movie camera, the cowboy was a document. Film captures the soul, and Robert was terrified of what the camera would see. During filming, he worked harder than he ever had in his life. He tried to give the cowboy depth. He tried to show the loneliness behind the smile. There is a scene in the film where the cowboy is dancing, awkward and out of place, trying desperately to please the men around him. It is a moment of pure, unadulterated vulnerability. Robert wasn't acting in that moment. He was pleading. He was pleading with the audience, with the camera, with the industry. See me. See me as a human being, not just a body. The filming wrapped, the anticipation built, the posters were printed. The film version of The Boys in the Band premiered in March 1970. For Robert La Tourneaux, the premiere should have been a coronation. He walked the red carpet in a tuxedo, flashing that million-dollar smile, flanked by the men who had become his brothers in the trenches of production. The flashbulbs popped. The reporters shouted his name. Robert! Robert! Over here! For one night, he was a movie star. He was the visual anchor of the most talked-about film in America. But when the lights came up and the reviews came out, the narrative shifted. The critics didn't treat Robert like a discovery. They treated him like a specimen. While his co-stars, Cliff Gorman, Leonard Frey, Kenneth Nelson, were praised for their brave acting or their transformations, Robert received a different kind of attention. The New York Times, Variety, and the local papers all focused on his physicality. They described the cowboy as beautiful but vacant, a stunning object, or perfectly cast. The phrase perfectly cast is the most dangerous compliment an actor can receive. In Robert's case, it was a coded insult. It implied that the distance between the actor and the role was zero. The industry looked at the screen and decided he isn't acting. He's just a dumb hustler they found and put in front of a camera. This perception was fatal. In 1970, Hollywood was obsessed with authenticity, but only the safe kind. Dustin Hoffman could play a street hustler in Midnight Cowboy because everyone knew he was a serious, straight actor slumming it. It was a performance. But because Robert was gay and because he played the role with such terrifying natural ease, the industry stripped him of his craft. They denied him the dignity of performance. The box office numbers came in. The film made money. It was a hit. Robert waited by the phone in his New York apartment. He had an agent. He had a portfolio. He had a hit movie. He waited for the offers to roll in. He waited for the scripts where he would play the romantic lead, the detective, or the soldier. The phone rang, but it wasn't Hollywood calling. It was the same old crowd, parties, gallery openings, men who wanted to date the cowboy. The studios were silent. Months passed. The silence became a noise of its own. Robert's agent tried to pitch him. The feedback was consistent, brutal, and off the record. Casting directors were blunt. He's too pretty. He's too specific. He's the guy from the fag movie. This was the cowboy trap. By playing the ultimate object of gay desire, Robert had become radioactive to mainstream Hollywood. In 1971, a straight leading man had to be unassailable. He had to be John Wayne or Steve McQueen. He couldn't be the guy who had been gifted as a birthday present to another man on screen. The homophobia of the era wasn't just about hate. It was about marketing. Producers were terrified that if they cast Robert as a hero, the audience would laugh. They feared that his presence would queer the movie. Robert fought back. He wasn't ready to surrender. He pushed for roles that were diametrically opposed to the cowboy. He landed a small role in the 1971 film Von Richthofen and Brown, also known as the Red Baron. It was a war movie directed by Roger Corman, the king of B-movies. It was gritty, masculine, and violent. It was exactly the kind of pivot Robert needed. He cut his hair. He wore the uniform. He tried to project a hard military edge, but the role was too small. He was a face in the background. The film didn't make a splash, and even if it had, Robert didn't have enough screen time to erase the image of the cowboy. The audience saw him and thought, wait, isn't that the guy from... The image was too sticky. He tried again in 1972 with a film called Pilgrimage, another small part, another failure to launch. The frustration began to eat him alive. He watched his co-stars from The Boys in the Band move on. Cliff Gorman won a Tony Award for playing Lenny Bruce. Lawrence Luckinbill married Lucy Arnaz and became a TV staple. They were allowed to have careers. They were allowed to be versatile. Robert was not. He was frozen in time. He was the 1970 cowboy, forever young, forever dumb, forever gay. There is a myth that fame equals wealth. In the early 1970s, for a working actor in New York, this was a cruel lie. Robert had been paid for the movie, but the money didn't last forever. He lived in Manhattan, one of the most expensive cities in the world. He had to maintain appearances. An actor has overhead, headshots, clothes, gym memberships, drinks at the right bars where the producers hang out. By 1973, the money was running out. He couldn't go back to waiting tables without being recognized. Imagine the humiliation. You are the star of a hit movie, your face is on posters, but you are asking a customer if they want fries with that. The shame was a barrier. He returned to modeling, but the dynamic had shifted. Before the movie, he was a blank canvas. Now, he was a personality. He started posing for gay lifestyle magazines after Dark Advocate and sleazier underground publications. The captions always referenced the cowboy. See the star boys in the band unbuttoned. He was selling his past. He was strip mining his own legacy for rent money. It was during this period, 1973 and 1974, that the resentment began to harden into a diamond-hard bitterness. Robert began to see the industry not as a ladder to climb, but as a vampire that had already fed. He was still invited to the A-list parties. He was still Robert La Tourneaux. Rich men wanted him at their dinner tables. They wanted him to be the ornament. They wanted to tell their friends, "Look who I have sitting next to me." He was a trophy. He would sit at these dinners drinking expensive wine, wearing borrowed suits, knowing he didn't have enough money for a subway token home. He listened to producers talk about their new projects he was never considered for. He listened to them joke about faggots while he sat right there, smiling, dying inside. This is where the soul begins to erode. When you are surrounded by wealth but denied access to it, when you are celebrated for your face but despised for your identity, you start to hate the people clapping for you. By 1974, Robert was 33 years old. In the youth-obsessed culture of gay New York, he was approaching middle age. The desperation became palpable. He was no longer the next big thing. He was the thing that didn't happen. He began to spend more time in the dark. New York City in the mid-70s was entering its notorious era of decay and decadence. Times Square was transforming into a playground of vice. The pristine lights of Broadway were just a few blocks away from the grindhouse theaters and the hustler bars. Robert began to drift. He stopped going to auditions. Why bother? The answer was always no. The feedback loop of rejection was destroying his confidence. An actor needs a thick skin, but Robert's skin had been flayed. He found that his value, his only remaining currency, was sexual. He had always known this. Since St. Louis, he knew people wanted him. But now, without the shield of artist or actor to protect him, he was left with only the raw transaction. He began to accept gifts from wealthy admirers. A paid dinner here, a covered rent check there. It wasn't explicit prostitution yet, but it was the gray zone. It was the survival economy of the beautiful and discarded. He was testing the waters of the underworld. He found that in the dark, nobody cared about his acting range. Nobody cared about his reviews. In the dark, he was a king. He was the cowboy. He was the fantasy made flesh. It was a seduction of a different kind. If Hollywood wouldn't pay him to be the cowboy on screen, the streets of New York would pay him to be the cowboy in real life. The tragedy of this period, 1970 to 1974, is the waste. Robert was in his prime. He was healthy, he was talented, and he was willing to work. He could have been a great character actor. He could have been a villain on Columbo or a romantic lead in a soap opera. But the industry was rigid. They looked at a man who was honest about who he was, and they punished him for it. They pushed him to the margins, and on the margins, predators were waiting. There is one final footnote to this era of his life. In 1974, he tried one last time to get back on stage. He participated in a few small off-Broadway readings. He showed up, he read the lines. Witnesses from that time remember a change in him. The bright, eager energy of 1968 was gone. In its place was a sharp, jagged edge. He was angry. He argued with directors. He was cynical about the process. He had seen behind the curtain. He knew the game was rigged. There is a story from this time of Robert walking past a movie theater playing a revival of The Boys in the Band. He stopped and looked at the poster. He looked at his own face, 5 years younger, frozen in that naive, hopeful expression. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned his collar up against the wind and walked away. He wasn't walking toward an audition. He was walking toward the West Side Highway, toward the Ramrod Theater, toward the night. By 1975, the silence from Hollywood had solidified into a permanent exile, and Robert La Tourneaux found himself standing at the intersection of desperation and survival in a New York City that was rapidly descending into bankruptcy and chaos. The phone that once rang with offers from agents now only rang with creditors or men looking for a good time. And Robert, with the pragmatic fatalism of a man who knows his options are exhausted, began to answer the latter. The transition from actor to commodity was not a sudden cliff drop, but a slow, agonizing slide down a slope of compromises, where each step away from his dignity was justified by the need to pay rent in a city that devoured the poor. He had spent years trying to convince the world he was more than a body, more than a pretty face. But the world had voted with its wallet, and the verdict was clear. Nobody wanted Robert La Tourneaux, the artist, but everyone wanted the cowboy. The initial descent began in the gloss of the magazine racks, where Robert returned to modeling not as a high-fashion aspiration, but as a niche fantasy for a burgeoning gay subculture. He appeared in publications that sat on the razor's edge of legality, magazines like Advocate and a later more explicit Underground Rags, where the captions didn't discuss his acting range or his time on Broadway, but fixated entirely on his physical dimensions and his availability. It was a humiliating demotion for a man who had been reviewed by the New York Times. Yet there was a perverse comfort in it, because the camera still loved him, and in the flash of the strobe light, he could pretend he was still a star. He was selling the only asset that hadn't depreciated, his all-American beauty, but the context had shifted from the red carpet to the bedside table, and with every photo shoot, the cowboy persona was hammered deeper into his skin like a tattoo he could never remove. As the modeling gigs became sporadic and the money dwindled, Robert drifted toward the epicenter of New York's gay nightlife, specifically the West Side Highway and the Meatpacking District, a rugged industrial wasteland that came alive at night with leather bars, sex clubs, and men seeking anonymity in the dark. It was here, at the infamous Ramrod Theater and Bar, that Robert La Tourneaux eventually found his new stage. The Ramrod was not the Mark Hellinger Theater. It was a grimy, sweat-slicked venue that smelled of stale beer, amyl nitrate, and desperation, a place where men went to lose themselves. And it was here that the Broadway actor began working as a go-go dancer and eventually a hustler. He danced on a bar top or a small platform, his body illuminated by red gels, moving to the thumping disco bass for dollar bills tucked into his waistband, a tragic parody of the fame he had once sought. The patrons of the Ramrod knew exactly who he was, and that was part of the allure. They weren't just buying a dance from a handsome stranger. They were buying a moment with a fallen movie star, a piece of Hollywood that had been discarded and washed up on their shore. There was a cruelty to this adoration, a sense that the men slipping money into his hand were enjoying the spectacle of his degradation as much as his beauty. They whispered his name. That's the cowboy from the movie, transforming him into a living souvenir, a breathing artifact of a cultural moment that had already passed. Robert, with a hardening heart, learned to dissociate in these moments, to wear the cowboy smile like a mask while his mind retreated to a safe distance, watching the transaction from above with cold detachment. He realized that if the industry wouldn't pay him to play the hustler on screen, The streets would pay him to be the hustler in reality. And in a twisted way, he was finally giving the world the authenticity it claimed to want. However, the spark of the artist in him refused to be fully extinguished, and in 1977 a final cruel glimmer of hope appeared in the form of Tennessee Williams. The legendary playwright was casting for his new play, Vieux Carré, a memory play about New Orleans that was set to open on Broadway. And against all odds, Robert secured a role. It was a lifeline thrown into the abyss, a chance to wash off the grime of the ramrod and stand on a legitimate stage again, to prove to the critics and to himself that he was still an actor capable of delivering a performance. He threw himself into the preparation with a frantic intensity, believing that Vieux Carré would be his resurrection, the role that would remind New York that Robert La Tourneaux was a talent, not a joke. But the industry had a long memory and a ruthless gatekeeping mechanism. Just prior to the play's opening, in a move that remains shrouded in the murky politics of backstage theater, Robert was fired from the production. The reasons given were vague: artistic differences, instability, but the reality felt like a targeted erasure. His name was scrubbed from the program as if he had never been there, his face removed from the promotional materials, and he was escorted out of the theater and back onto the street. This rejection was not just a professional setback, it was a psychological execution. It confirmed his deepest fear, that there was no way back, that the door to his former life had been bricked up, and that he was permanently exiled to the underworld he had been flirting with. The firing from Vieux Carré broke something vital in Robert. The fragility that had defined his youth calcified into a bitter, jagged rage. He stopped apologizing for his life. He stopped trying to hide. If Hollywood treated him like a whore, he would show them exactly what a whore looked like, and he would drag their hypocrisy into the light with him. In 1978, completely disillusioned and fueled by a nihilistic anger, Robert gave a scorching interview to a gay tabloid in which he decided to burn the bridge he was standing on. He spoke openly about his life as a hustler, detailing the mechanics of the trade with a bluntness that shocked readers. But he didn't stop there. In a move that was tantamount to social suicide, Robert began to name names. He claimed that his client list included some of the most powerful, respectable men in entertainment. Married men, family men, the very producers and directors who refused to hire him for acting roles, but were more than happy to hire him for an hour in a hotel room. He exposed the moral rot at the core of the industry, screaming that the people who had blacklisted him for being too gay were the same ones soliciting sex from him in the shadows. It was a scream of pure defiance, a fuck you to the establishment that had used him as a resource. He described the specific hypocrisy of the closeted elite, men who protected their own reputations while destroying his, men who treated him like a disposable toy to be played with, and then hidden away in the toy box. By the dawn of the 1980s, the glittering promise of Robert La Tourneau's youth had completely calcified into a hard, brittle shell of survival, and the man who once graced the screen in Technicolor was now living in the grain of a gritty black and white reality. The transition from the disco era to the Reagan years brought a chill to New York City, a hardening of attitudes toward the poor and the marginalized. And Robert, now in his early 40s, found himself on the wrong side of every line that mattered. He was no longer the fresh-faced cowboy who could charm his way into a penthouse. He was an aging sex worker in a youth-obsessed market, competing with runaway teenagers for the attention of men who treated them all like disposable razors. The anger that had fueled his explosive interviews in the late 70s had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, mechanical desperation that drove him to take risks he never would have considered a decade prior. This desperation culminated in a singular, violent act in 1983 that shattered whatever remained of his civilian life. Robert was arrested and charged with assault after an altercation with a client, an incident that was less a calculated crime and more the frantic lashing out of a cornered animal. The specific details of the night were murky. A dispute over money, a moment of perceived disrespect, a flash of rage, but the legal system had no interest in nuance or the backstory of a fallen star. To the police and the courts, Robert La Tourneaux was not a tragic figure or a former Broadway actor. He was just another statistic, a violent hustler to be processed and removed from the streets to make the city safer for the very people who used to buy his body. He was handcuffed, fingerprinted, and stripped of his freedom, the final indignity in a career that had been a long series of thefts. He was sent to Rikers Island, a penal colony sitting in the East River that was widely considered one of the most dangerous jails in America. In 1983, Rikers was a pressure cooker of violence, overcrowding, and neglect, a place where the social contract had completely dissolved. For a man like Robert, whose life had been defined by his physical beauty and his sensitivity, Rikers was a sensory nightmare of concrete, steel, and constant thrumming aggression. He was thrown into a cell, surrounded by men who saw weakness as prey, and the survival skills he had learned in Hollywood, charm, deflection, performance, were useless against the brute force of incarceration. He was stripped of his identity, given a number, and forced to navigate a hierarchy where he was at the absolute bottom, a pretty boy, aging into obscurity, trapped in a cage with no audience. It was within the walls of this hell that the final, most devastating blow landed. Robert began to feel a sickness that was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix and a fever that wouldn't break. Then came the marks, purple lesions appearing on his skin, the telltale sign of Kaposi's sarcoma, the cancer that was becoming the terrifying signature of a new mysterious plague. He was taken to the prison infirmary, a place that was less a hospital and more a holding pen for the dying, where overworked and terrified doctors were just beginning to grapple with a virus they didn't understand. The diagnosis came back with the weight of a sledgehammer. Robert had AIDS. In 1983, a diagnosis of AIDS in the outside world was a social death sentence, but inside a prison, it was torture. The fear of the virus was absolute and hysterical. Corrections officers wore masks and gloves, refusing to touch inmates who were infected, often sliding food trays across the floor to avoid contact. Robert was moved into isolation, treated not as a patient who needed care, but as a biological hazard that needed containment. He was locked in a solitary cell, cut off from the general population, left to rot in a room where the silence was broken only by the sound of his own labored breathing. There were no antiviral cocktails, no compassionate nurses, no support groups, just the cold indifference of the state watching a man disintegrate. The psychological toll of this isolation was catastrophic. Robert was trapped in a box with his own mortality, forced to watch his body, the instrument that had been his ticket to fame, his source of income, and his curse, betray him in the most gruesome way possible. The lesions spread. The weight dropped off his frame until his ribs pressed against his skin like the bars of his cell, and the face that had once been plastered on movie posters became a gaunt skeletal mask of suffering. In a moment of absolute despair, unable to bear the physical pain and the crushing loneliness, Robert attempted suicide in his cell. It was a final bid for autonomy, a desire to write the ending of his own script rather than let the virus and the prison system dictate his demise. But the system, in its cruel efficiency, would not let him go that easily. He was found, resuscitated, and placed on suicide watch, a perverse intervention that saved his life only to prolong his agony. He was kept alive not out of mercy but out of liability, forced to continue his sentence in a body that was actively killing him. The irony was suffocating. The world that had refused to employ him, refused to house him, and refused to acknowledge him was now using all its power to keep him trapped in a state of suspended suffering. Robert La Tourneaux lay on a cot in a prison ward, a ghost haunting his own life, waiting for a release that the courts were too slow to grant, and death was too slow to deliver. When the gates of Rikers Island finally opened to release Robert La Tourneaux in 1984, it was not an act of mercy, but a bureaucratic disposal. The penal system, overwhelmed by the rising tide of the AIDS epidemic and terrified of the liability involved in housing dying inmates, simply ejected him back into the bloodstream of New York City. He was free, but freedom is a relative term when your body has become a prison of its own. Robert walked out of the facility a shadow of the man who had entered, his once sculpted physique now wasted away to a skeletal frame of barely 100 pounds, his skin a roadmap of purple Kaposi sarcoma lesions that marked him as a walking biohazard in the eyes of a panicked public. He returned to a city that was in the grip of a hysteria unlike anything it had seen before, where the mere rumor of infection was enough to end friendships, terminate employment, and, as Robert was about to discover, threaten the very roof over his head. He retreated to his small, rent-controlled apartment, a sanctuary that had been his anchor through the years of hustling and decline. But the sanctuary was under siege. His landlord, discovering that his tenant was not only an ex-convict, but a person with AIDS, initiated legal proceedings to evict him. This was the brutal reality of New York real estate in the mid-1980s. Landlords, driven by a combination of greed and phobia, viewed the epidemic as a convenient tool to clear out low-paying tenants and deregulate valuable apartments. Robert, who could barely stand without assistance and whose immune system was collapsing under the weight of a common cold, found himself drafted into a war he had no energy to fight. He was forced to navigate the labyrinth of housing court, dragging his decaying body before judges and lawyers to argue for his right to die in his own bed rather than in a gutter. The courtroom became a theater of cruelty that rivaled anything he had experienced in Hollywood. When Robert appeared for hearings, the room would often clear, people pressing themselves against the back walls to maximize the distance between their healthy bodies and his infected one. The landlord's legal team argued that his presence was a danger to the building, a nuisance, a blight, using the vague, terrifying language of the time to dehumanize him completely. They didn't see a tenant, they saw a contamination. Robert sat there, a man who had once been paid thousands of dollars just to be looked at, now being scrutinized with a mixture of horror and disgust. He was fighting for the most basic human necessity, shelter, while his opponent fought for property value, highlighting the absolute moral bankruptcy of a city that had decided some lives were simply bad investments. During this period, the isolation was total and suffocating. The phone didn't ring because most of the people who had his number were either dead, dying, or too terrified to associate with him. The friends from the glittery disco era, the wealthy patrons who had once bought him drinks at Studio 54, the producers who had invited him to parties, they had all vanished into the woodwork of respectability. Robert was left to manage his illness with almost no resources, navigating a healthcare system that was hostile to his existence. He had to rely on a patchwork of support from the few AIDS organizations that were just beginning to form, staffed by volunteers who were themselves overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the dying. Every day was a logistical nightmare of managing symptoms, securing food, and preparing for the next court date, a grinding routine that stripped away whatever dignity he had managed to hold on to in prison. Yet, in this absolute darkness, Robert displayed a stubborn, almost spiteful resilience. He refused to leave the apartment. He understood that the apartment was the last vestige of his life as a human being, the only place where he was Robert and not the patient or the inmate. He fought the eviction with a ferocity that surprised everyone, channeling the same intensity he had once brought to the stage into the drafting of legal affidavits and the gathering of medical records. He was determined that he would not give the landlord the satisfaction of an empty unit. If they wanted him out, they would have to carry him out in a body bag. It was a grim victory, but a victory nonetheless, as the courts, moving with the slow friction of bureaucracy, granted him stays and extensions that allowed him to remain, effectively ruling that the landlord had to wait for death to do the eviction work for him. As 1985 bled into 1986, Robert's world shrank to the four walls of his bedroom. The lesions had spread to his internal organs, the fatigue was constant, and his mind began to drift in and out of the present, lost in the fever dreams of a life that felt like it had happened to someone else. He lay in the dim light of his apartment, surrounded by the artifacts of his past, headshots from the doctors, a faded poster of the boys in the band, clippings from magazines that no longer existed, and waited. The city outside continued to roar, the stock market boomed, the theaters of Broadway sold tickets to new shows with new stars, but in that small room, time had stopped. He was a ghost haunting his own wake, a man who had been consumed by the twin engines of American commerce, the entertainment industry that used his image and the real estate industry that wanted his space. By late 1985, Robert was fighting a losing battle on all fronts. Inside, the virus was consuming his organs. Outside, the landlord was besieging his apartment. He was a skeleton trapped in a rent-controlled fortress, too weak to clean, too proud to leave, and utterly alone. The entourage of the 1970s had vanished. The phone was dead. Yet, in this absolute darkness, a figure from his past emerged. It wasn't a lover. It wasn't a producer. It was the man who had mocked him on stage 18 years earlier, Cliff Gorman. In The Boys in the Band, Cliff had played Emery, the flamboyant, effeminate, sharp-tongued character who was the polar opposite of Robert's stoic, masculine Cowboy. On screen, Emery mocked Cowboy. In reality, Cliff was a straight, married man with a tough, working-class exterior, a serious actor who had moved on to win a Tony Award and build a respectable career. There was no reason for Cliff to be there. They weren't best friends during filming. They moved in different circles, lived different lives, and hadn't been close in nearly a decade. Yet when word reached the theater community that Robert was dying alone, destitute, and branded a pariah, Cliff Gorman didn't hesitate. Cliff and his wife Gail stepped into the breach when everyone else stepped back. They didn't send a check. They sent themselves. At a time when nurses were leaving trays of food outside hospital doors for fear of infection, and when funeral homes were refusing to handle the bodies of AIDS victims, Cliff and Gail walked into Robert's apartment without masks, without gloves, and without judgment. They found a man who was barely recognizable, a skeleton wrapped in lesions, living in squalor because he was too weak to clean and too poor to hire help. The all-American boy was rotting, and the Gormans didn't look away. They sat by his bed. They held his hand, a simple, tactile act of grace that was practically revolutionary in the hysteria of 1986. This was not a celebrity photo op. There were no cameras documenting Cliff's charity. It was a gritty, exhausting, and dangerous labor of love. Cliff became Robert's advocate, his protector, and his voice when Robert could no longer speak for himself. He navigated the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the New York healthcare system, fighting with hospital administrators to ensure Robert received pain medication, battling with social workers to keep his benefits active, and standing as a physical barrier between Robert and the landlords who were still trying to evict him. The irony was searing. The straight actor who had played the stereotypical queen was the one showing the most profound masculine strength, while the gay community's power brokers, terrified of being associated with the plague, were largely absent. Cliff looked at Robert not as a victim of his own lifestyle or a fallen star, but as a colleague, a fellow soldier from the trenches of 1968 who had been left behind on the battlefield. As Robert's condition deteriorated to the point where home care was no longer possible, Cliff and Gail arranged for his transfer to Metropolitan Hospital. The move was a logistical nightmare, a parade of indignities as ambulance crews and orderlies treated Robert like radioactive waste. But Cliff remained a constant presence, a tether to the world of the living. In the sterile fluorescent glare of the hospital ward, Robert spent his final weeks drifting between consciousness and coma. When he was awake, he was often confused, terrified, and in pain, but the presence of Cliff offered a singular comfort. He was not forgotten. The man who had shared the screen with him, who had been part of the moment that defined and destroyed his life, was there to see it through to the end. The relationship between Cliff and Robert in those final months exposed the ultimate hollowness of Hollywood's family narrative. The studios that had made millions off the boys in the band sent nothing. The producers who had blacklisted Robert for being too gay sent nothing. The fans who had fantasized about the Cowboy sent nothing. It was just Cliff, a man who owed Robert nothing but gave him everything, driven by a personal code of decency that the industry could neither understand nor replicate. In the end, as the virus claimed the last of Robert's faculties, the only face he recognized was the one that had mocked him on stage 18 years earlier, now looking at him with an expression of infinite sorrow and respect. On June 3, 1986, in a sterile room at Metropolitan Hospital, Robert La Tourneaux took his final breath. He was 44 years old, yet the face staring at the ceiling was unrecognizable. A skeletal mask worn down by a century of pain compressed into a single decade. There were no weeping fans, no flashing cameras, and no producers by his bedside. The silence was absolute. His exit was as brutal as his fall. The New York Times reduced his chaotic, tragic life to a few polite inches of text, sanitizing the horror of Rikers Island and the humiliation of the streets. Even in death, his body was treated as hazardous waste, hurriedly cremated by a system terrified of his illness. His few belongings were discarded, and his apartment was scrubbed clean, erasing the last physical traces of the man who had once been the toast of Broadway. The ultimate tragedy was not his death, but his despair. Robert died believing the lie. He slipped away in the dark, convinced he was the failure the industry said he was, unaware that the cowboy would outlive the men who destroyed him. He died as he had lived in those final years, a disposable object, used up and thrown away, leaving behind only the flickering image of a beautiful, confused boy dancing on a screen, frozen forever in the moment before the world broke him.